Hey, so I recently saw Guardians of the Galaxy 3 and it was great. This is one I've been looking forward to a while because I'm a big James Gunn fan, and this trilogy now represents half of the movies he's directed. I always thought it was funny that the guy who did Slither and Super got tapped to do a Marvel movie, but it turned out to be a great idea. I remember when the first one came out, it just felt so different and fresh. Not even just for a superhero movie, but for Hollywood in general. Like, we had never really seen anything like it before. I think the fact that Guardians was allowed to be its own separate story mostly from a single writer director really elevated it above the rest of the MCU. There are a lot of Marvel movies I've enjoyed over the years, but if I'm being honest, I don't think most of them will age very well. I mean, The Avengers was a great movie at the time, but I don't think many people are going to be going back to watch it in 10 or 20 years. Even something like Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is a top tier Marvel movie, probably wouldn't work as well without the context of all those other movies. But I have a feeling Guardians of the Galaxy will still hold up pretty well. Mainly because they don't rely on nostalgia or connection to other media to appeal to people. Anyway, let's get down to talking about the actual movie. In my opinion, Guardians 3 is the best of the trilogy. The first Guardians was really great at the time, but I think in retrospect it feels a lot less creatively ambitious than the other two. The characters all have pretty thin backstories and simple motives. The villain is a generic evil guy who just wants to take over the universe, and at the end they have to beat him by all holding hands and using the power of friendship. None of that is inherently bad or anything. I'm just saying that I think what makes the first movie really special is more about style than substance. The second movie is a lot more creatively ambitious, and feels like it's interested in questioning some of the assumptions that feel built into the first one. Maybe it's fair for Gamora to be turned off by Quill's cockiness. Maybe he's acting kind of arrogant and entitled. Maybe Nebula's not just a simple bad guy. Maybe Gamora was kind of a shitty sister to her. And fittingly, the overall story of that movie is about overcoming narcissism and entitlement, learning to see other people as equally important to yourself. That's why the villain in that movie is named Ego, and he's trying to turn all life in the universe into an extension of him.
It's metaphorical!
And I'm just scratching the surface here. That whole movie's dripping with subtext. All that said, I can see why a lot of people don't like 2 as much. It's a messier movie. There's so much going on, the pacing's a bit wonky, and some of the dialogue feels a little heavy-handed. And I think some people had a bit of a hard time following the plot with Ego, which is understandable because it's a little high concept and maybe could have been explained better. Anyway, I say all this to say that I think Guardians 3 has the strengths of both previous movies. It's a lot stronger on a character level than the first one, and it has some interesting subtext, but it's a much tighter movie than 2. Which is impressive because it's a pretty big ensemble cast, and everybody gets some nice character moments. This one focuses a lot more on Rocket. We get to learn about his origin, and the villain of the movie is his creator. Basically, this guy, the High Evolutionary, has been genetically engineering all kinds of races to try and create the perfect society. But nothing ever lives up to his standards of perfection, which leads him to exterminate entire populations. Rocket is kind of a failed experiment of his, who he considered too gross and weird for his perfect world, but is also, according to him, the only one of his creations who is capable of having original ideas. So now he wants to extract Rocket's brain. So that gives us what I would say is the main theme of the movie, accepting the imperfect. At the end, when High Evolutionary is beaten, he says to Rocket, "I only wanted to make things perfect." And Rocket says, "You didn't want to make things perfect. You just hated things the way they were." Which feels like a good indictment of certain fashy ways of thinking. That said, Quill is still the main protagonist, even if this one's a lot more Rocket heavy, and I think this movie is a great completion to his storyline. I'm going to be getting into some bigger spoilers now, by the way. I was really glad that Quill and Gamora didn't get together at the end. I think that would have felt a little out of character if they had actually followed through with it. Especially since Gamora in this movie is a version of her from the past who doesn't know him. Speaking of which, this movie's going to be confusing as hell for people who see it in the future without seeing Infinity War. But yeah, when they meet again in this movie, Quill immediately starts hitting her with his expectations for a relationship, which is pretty fucked up when you think about it. The movie suggests that Quill has this tendency to make women the solution to all his problems, which I think squares well with his past. He always seemed like the kind of womanizer who's more in it for the emotional validation. He's kind of needy. He can't stand being alone, and he expects women to make him feel better. If I wanted to get all Freudian with this analysis, I might connect it to the fact that he was raised by a single mother who died when he was young. Anyway, this is all spelled out pretty clearly for the audience. Drax basically tells him, you've been jumping from woman to woman your whole life. Maybe you need to learn to be alone. And fittingly, at the end, instead of pursuing another relationship, he decides to reconnect with his estranged family, which he had avoided doing his entire life. So that shows a lot of emotional growth and a willingness to engage with his own issues instead of looking for someone to make him complete. It's one of those want versus need arcs. The main character starts out with something they want but don't need, and something they need but don't want, and the character arc is watching them figure that out. I know a lot of people wanted Quill and Gamora to get together at the end, but this is just so much more interesting to me. And it's kind of fitting for this movie that their storylines don't really feel wrapped up. Normally, the end of a trilogy is supposed to feel conclusive. You expect to get an idea of what each character is going to be doing for the rest of their lives, so you feel like you got closure. But this movie feels kind of purposely open-ended. It feels less like each character gets an ending, and more like each character gets a new beginning, and their futures are full of possibility. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about accepting imperfect things. We're all a work in progress, and that's okay. By the way, do I even need to mention the fact that this movie's incredibly stylish? I mean, it's a James Gunn superhero movie. So yeah, the sets, the props, the costumes, the makeup, all fantastic. The movie also makes great use of licensed music, but if you're even halfway familiar with the series, you already know that. So yeah, great movie. I highly recommend all three. Man, it's a great summer for movies, isn't it? I think I'm going to check out that Ninja Turtles one next. I hear good things. I have to say, I think this is going to be the last Marvel movie I'm really interested in, at least for a while. The novelty of this big, interconnected cinematic universe is kind of wearing thin at this point. The last couple Marvel movies I saw before this seemed like they were more interested in setting things up and connecting things than they were in just being good movies in and of themselves. And everything they do now just feels so safe and boring, which is pretty typical of how Disney treats their big IPs. Personally, I think it's a bad strategy. These comic book universes are at their best when they're letting writers just throw whatever they want at the wall and see what sticks. Part of the reason this stuff has worked so long in the comics is that industry has much lower stakes, so they'll let writers try whatever weird shit they want to do. The situation with Jonathan Majors is a good example of how long-term planning can get you in trouble in this business. He's supposed to be the big overarching villain for the next phase, the new Thanos, and now he's been arrested for domestic violence, and all these other allegations about him are surfacing. So is Disney gonna fire him? I mean, you'd think, right? They fired James Gunn for some bad tweets in 2009. But I don't know, maybe they thought they could do that to Gunn because he wasn't on camera. In any case, it's a mess. Speaking of Disney corporate strategy, I recently heard an interpretation of this movie that I just have to relate. Apparently, some people think this movie is about how James Gunn feels he was treated by Disney, and I have to admit, it fits pretty well. Gunn has always said that Rocket is the character most based on himself. So here we've got the High Evolutionary, this villain who owns a massive corporation that essentially creates worlds. He seems to be obsessed with creating some kind of idealized version of America in the past. And for some reason, he loves to make talking animals. He shuns Rocket for being flawed, but then ends up needing him back because Rocket's the only one who can have original ideas. I don't know if this was intentional, but it's definitely food for thought. I mean, looking at the current situation with the writer's strike, it does seem like studios would rather extract someone's brain to get their ideas than support the actual person. Anyway, the future's looking bright for James Gunn, who apparently is going to be overseeing the entire DC universe now, starting with a Superman movie written and directed by him. I guess that's not surprising, considering the success of The Suicide Squad and the two popular shows he was an executive producer on. Great stuff, by the way. I'm watching through season 4 of Harley Quinn right now, and it's hilarious. So I am optimistic about the James Gunn DC universe. I think he could really breathe some new life into it. On the other hand, I have to say I'm a little disappointed that he's going straight to this. I mean, he's done so much for Marvel and DC, and it makes me wonder, is he ever gonna make another movie that's like his own project? I mean, he's got the clout to do whatever he wants. It'd be nice if he could take a break to do another weird horror movie. I guess I just feel like he's a great writer, and although I'm a sucker for the superhero stuff, it still feels like a bit of a shame if he lets the rest of his career be defined by these big corporate projects. I guess what I'm saying is make Slither too, you coward!